It was 4:23 a.m. on a Thursday that tasted of antiseptic, desperation, and the copper-bright smell of someone else's blood. Sacred Heart's trauma ward existed in a perpetual state of fluorescent-lit purgatory. Buzzing lights that flickered just enough to make you question reality, casting jaundiced shadows across linoleum tiles cracked from years of gurneys racing toward miracles that never came cheap. Larry stood at the industrial steel sink, watching water spiral from clear to crimson as it circled the drain. His hands were steady, they were always steady when it mattered, but his entire body vibrated with the particular exhaustion that came from wrestling death and winning. 27 years old, honey-brown skin bearing the pallor of too many double shifts, dark eyes that had witnessed the exact moment insurance policies became death sentences. He was an omega in a profession that barely tolerated his designation, wearing industrial-grade scent blockers that turned his natural warmth into clinical nothing. He had saved him. The John Doe in Trauma 3, uninsured, unnamed, unviable by hospital metrics, had arrived with internal bleeding that should have killed him in minutes. Protocol demanded stabilization and transfer. Protocol demanded Larry preserve the $8,000 dose of Revascol 7 for patients who could pay. Protocol could go to hell. Larry had injected the drug, watched cellular regeneration occur in real time, felt the patient's pulse strengthen under his fingertips. The man would live. That was all that mattered. Then he heard it. Click. 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 Italian leather on cheap hospital flooring, a sound that didn't belong here, that spoke of expense and cruelty in equal measure. The footsteps were methodical, predatory, the acoustic signature of a man who fed on other people's fear. Larry didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He knew that gait, that rhythm, that particular brand of approaching doom. Director Holloway. Beta. 32. Jawline sharp enough to cut budgets and kill hope. He wore suits that cost more than Larry's annual suppressant prescription, and he ran Sacred Heart Medical Center like a corporation, not a place where desperate people came to not die. He stopped in the scrub room doorway, and Larry could feel his presence like a cold front moving in, the pressure change before the storm breaks and destroys everything in its path. Holloway wasn't looking at Larry's face. He was looking at his tablet, at the inventory report that had just flagged an $8,000 discrepancy. At the evidence of Larry's crime. $8,472. Holloway's voice was soft, conversational even, the kind of tone middle management used when they wanted you to know the knife was coming but couldn't be bothered to raise their voice for the killing blow. He stepped into the scrub room, and behind him, two security guards materialized like sentries, both alphas, both wearing expressions of professional disinterest that didn't quite hide their discomfort. Larry dried his hands with deliberate slowness, each movement precise. He wouldn't give Holloway the satisfaction of panic. The patient is stable. The patient, Holloway said, finally looking up from his tablet, is a financial liability. The patient has no insurance, no identification, no next of kin to bill. The patient is a hole in this hospital's quarterly budget. He swiped his screen, and the blue light cast his features in a cold, digital glow. But you know what the real problem is, Larry? Larry said nothing. Experience had taught him that men like Holloway didn't actually want answers, they wanted audiences for their own brilliance. The real problem is that you know the protocol. You've been written up twice this year for similar incidents. Holloway moved closer, and Larry caught the scent of expensive cologne trying to mask the underlying sharpness of beta territoriality. You know that Revascol 7 is reserved for insured patients with documented viable outcomes. You know that your job is to stabilize and transfer, not to play God with hospital resources. My job, Larry said quietly, is to save lives. Your job, Holloway countered, his voice dropping to something almost intimate, almost kind, which made it worse, is to follow the directives of this institution. Your job is to understand that medicine is a business, and businesses require difficult decisions about resource allocation. He paused, letting the words settle like sediment. But you don't see it that way, do you? You think you're special. You think your dedication exempts you from the rules everyone else manages to follow. The way he said dedication made it sound like a character flaw. Larry felt the familiar weight pressing down on his chest, the weight of being an omega in a profession that barely tolerated his existence, the weight of every condescending concern about his emotional stability, his inability to handle high-stress situations, his designation-based limitations. Holloway was building toward something, and they both knew what it was. "You're not a hero, Larry." Holloway's eyes were flat, assessing, the look of a man calculating losses. "You're a liability with a God complex. And this hospital can't afford either." The words landed exactly where they were designed to, in that space where professional competence intersected with designation-based shame, where every achievement Larry had earned through blood and sleepless nights could be reframed as overcompensation, as instability, as proof that omegas didn't belong in trauma medicine. Behind Holloway, the two security guards shifted uncomfortably. One of them, Marcus, who'd worked night shift for 3 years, wouldn't meet Larry's eyes. "Your badge," Holloway said, extending his hand. It wasn't a request. Larry unclipped the ID badge from his scrub pocket. The laminated card felt heavier than it should, as if it had absorbed the weight of every shift, every life saved, every time he'd proven that designation didn't determine capability. He placed it in Holloway's palm without ceremony. "Access card." Larry handed it over. The magnetic stripe that opened restricted areas, that marked him as trusted, as essential, gone with a swipe of Holloway's hand into his suit pocket. "The scrubs are hospital property." For a moment, Larry thought he'd misheard. But Holloway's expression was implacable, and the security guards were already moving, positioning themselves on either side of the door, not threatening, just present. A reminder that resistance would be documented, that any refusal would be added to the file being built in real time on Holloway's tablet. Larry looked past them, through the scrub room's window into the main ER corridor. The night shift staff had gathered, nurses at the station pretending to chart, residents hovering near the medication room, the ward clerk frozen mid-keystroke. They were all watching. Some with pity that made Larry's skin crawl. Most with relief that it wasn't them standing in this room, being systematically stripped of everything that defined their professional existence. Sarah, a beta nurse who trained alongside Larry, met his gaze for half a second before looking away. Coward. They were all cowards, and maybe that was smart. Maybe self-preservation was its own kind of wisdom. Larry unbuttoned his scrub top with steady hands, removed it, folded it once. The undershirt beneath was damp with sweat from hours of high-intensity emergency medicine. He handed the scrubs to Marcus, who took them like he was accepting contaminated waste. "You'll be escorted out," Holloway said, already turning away, already moving on to the next line item on his administrative agenda. "I'll have HR send your final paycheck to your address on file. Consider this a termination with cause, which means you'll have a hard time explaining it to future employers." He paused at the threshold, glancing back with something that might have been genuine curiosity. Was it worth it, Larry? $8,000 for a man who'll probably be back on whatever street corner produced him within a week. Larry thought of the patient's pulse, that moment when it had stuttered back into existence beneath his fingertips. He thought of every John Doe, every Jane Doe, every person the system had decided didn't matter enough to save. "Yes," he said. Holloway's smile was thin, pitying. "That's what I thought. Marcus, see him out. Make sure he doesn't access any patient files or restricted areas on the way." And just like that, it was over. 7 years of trauma certification, of proving himself in a field designed to exclude people like him, of building a reputation on skill rather than designation, reduced to a security escort and a termination with cause. The walk through the ER was a gauntlet of averted eyes and uncomfortable silence. Larry kept his spine straight, his expression neutral, even as humiliation burned through his chest like the expensive drugs he'd injected into a nameless patient's veins. Marcus held the door to the ambulance bay open, and Larry stepped out into the night. Into the rain that had started sometime during his shift, cold and relentless, washing away nothing. The rain was cold and deliberate, the kind that found every gap in inadequate clothing and reminded you exactly how small you were in the universe's indifferent machinery. Larry stood under the shallow overhang of Sacred Heart's ambulance bay, watching water sheet off the concrete lip above him in rhythmic curtains. Behind him, the automatic doors hissed open and closed as EMTs wheeled in another emergency. Someone else's crisis, someone else's problem now. Not his. Not anymore. He pulled out his phone with fingers already going numb from the cold. The screen illuminated his face in harsh blue-white, casting shadows under his eyes that made him look like something excavated rather than living. Banking app. Account balance, $127.43. Rent was due in 6 days. $850 for a studio apartment in a building where the heat worked intermittently and the neighbors pretended not to notice the Omega living alone on the 3rd floor. Suppressants were $340 for a month's supply, and he was down to 8 days before his next heat cycle. The prescription wasn't refillable without health insurance, which had just evaporated along with his employment. Larry did the math with the mechanical precision of someone who'd been doing survival calculations his entire adult life. He had enough for either rent or suppressants, not both. And that was before food, before utilities, before the student loans that had been bleeding him dry for 6 years. The scent blockers in his jacket pocket, half a pack, maybe 12 patches left, suddenly felt precious in a way they hadn't an hour ago. Without them, walking through the city as an unmated Omega was an invitation for attention he couldn't afford. Especially not if he went into heat without suppressants. He should call someone. That's what people did in situations like this, wasn't it? They called family, friends, someone with a couch and sympathy to spare. But Larry's family was 3 states away and communication had dwindled to obligatory holiday texts after he'd chosen nursing over the safer career paths they'd suggested. And friends, real friends, not just colleagues who'd proven their allegiance by looking away when it mattered, those were in short supply. The rain intensified, hammering the pavement like it was trying to drive something into the earth. Or out of it. Larry. He turned. Marcus stood just inside the doorway, one hand holding the door open, the other shoved deep in his security uniform pocket. The older beater's face was creased with years of night shifts and small regrets, the kind that accumulated when you chose paycheck over principle often enough that the choosing became automatic. You should get somewhere dry, Marcus said, but he didn't move, didn't step back inside where he belonged. Working on it. Larry's voice came out rougher than intended, abraded by exhaustion and something that felt dangerously close to self-pity. Marcus glanced over his shoulder, checking for witnesses, for administrators with tablets and termination authority, then stepped out into the rain. Water immediately darkened his uniform shirt, but he ignored it, crossing the few feet between them with the deliberate movement of someone making a decision they'd probably regret. Here. He pulled a folded $20 bill from his pocket, pressed it into Larry's hand before Larry could refuse. It's not much, but... Marcus, you don't have to. You did right, Marcus said, and his voice carried the weight of every time he hadn't done right, every time he'd escorted someone out or looked away or followed orders because mortgages and child support didn't pay themselves. That patient. You did right by him. The 20 felt like it weighed more than currency should. It felt like an apology, like absolution, like the kindest thing anyone had said to Larry all night, which somehow made it worse. Because kindness at rock bottom was a spotlight on exactly how far you'd fallen. Thanks, Larry managed, and the word tasted like ash. Marcus nodded, already backing toward the door, toward the warm fluorescent safety of employed people with ID badges and health insurance. Take care of yourself, kid. Then he was gone, and Larry was alone again with $147.43 and nowhere to go that didn't require explanations he was too tired to give. He could walk to the bus stop 6 blocks away, ride to his apartment, and lock himself inside until he figured out his next move. Except the next move required energy he didn't have, and the apartment would feel like a cell, temporary shelter before inevitable eviction. Or he could walk in a different direction, toward the 24-hour diner where the night manager didn't ask questions and the coffee was strong enough to double as industrial solvent. By himself a few hours in a booth, maybe send out some resume emails to hospitals that hadn't blacklisted him yet. Except Holloway's words echoed in the space between his ribs, termination with cause. Those 3 words would follow him like a diagnosis, coloring every interview, every background check, every chance at starting over. Larry tilted his head back, let the rain hit his face, and laughed, a short, bitter sound that died in the downpour. He'd saved a life tonight. He'd done exactly what 7 years of training and a lifetime of defying expectations had prepared him to do. And his reward was standing on a curb at 4:47 a.m., soaked through, calculating whether he could afford to keep his apartment or his hormones, while the hospital that had used him up and spit him out continued its fluorescent hum behind closed doors. Somewhere in Trauma 3, John Doe was breathing. His heart was beating because Larry had made it beat. That should mean something. That should be worth something beyond $20 and a security guard's guilty conscience. But the rain didn't care about worth, and neither did the account balance on his phone, and neither did the system that had decided his competence was less valuable than his compliance. Larry shoved the 20 into his pocket, hunched his shoulders against the cold, and wondered if dignity was supposed to keep you warm when everything else was gone. The evidence suggested otherwise. Behind him, an ambulance's siren wailed its approach, someone else's emergency, someone else's chance to be saved or discarded depending on what their insurance covered. The sound cut through the rain like a blade, and Larry turned away from it, toward the street, toward whatever came next in a world that had just made it very clear he was disposable. He was 3 steps into the rain, 3 steps toward nowhere in particular, when the light hit him. White gold and blinding, cutting through the storm like something divine or dangerous or both. The light was wrong. Not headlights, those were yellow-white, diffused, ordinary. This was white gold, concentrated, the kind of illumination that cost more than lighting had any right to cost. It cut through the rain like surgical precision, like something that didn't ask permission to exist, and Larry's first instinct was to step back under the overhang, away from whatever was coming. But his body had already made the decision to freeze, to watch, because something in his hindbrain recognized that when apex predators arrived, you didn't move. You assessed. You waited. The first vehicle rolled into view, and Larry's breath caught. Matte black. Armored plating visible even through the rain-distorted air. The SUV was massive, aggressive, the automotive equivalent of a threat delivered in silence. Windows tinted dark enough to be illegal in 3 states. Chrome accents that caught the white gold light and threw it back like a challenge. The vehicle cost more than Larry would earn in 5 years, more than he'd earned in the 7 years he'd just lost. Then came the second. Identical. Moving in formation. And a third. Larry counted them as they arrived, as they formed a perimeter around Sacred Heart's ER entrance with military precision. 6 vehicles total, each one a monument to wealth and power, each one occupied by shapes he could barely distinguish through the tinted glass, shapes that sat too still, too alert, like soldiers waiting for orders. The rain hammered down, but the convoy didn't care. Water sheeted off their armored shells, and the white gold lights, mounted on each vehicle, synchronized, created a circle of illumination that turned the ambulance bay into a stage. Into an arena. Inside the hospital, faces appeared at the windows. Nurses, residents, even patients who could walk pressed against the glass like spectators at an accident they couldn't look away from. Larry saw Sarah's mouth form an O of surprise. Saw one of the residents pull out his phone, already recording. Saw the night shift administrator, someone whose name Larry had never bothered learning, rush toward the entrance with an expression that vacillated between alarm and the desperate hope that this was very important people who might donate very large sums of money. Marcus appeared in the doorway again, hand on his radio, eyes wide. He looked at Larry, then at the convoy, then back at Larry with an expression that asked a question he didn't know how to voice. Is this for you? Larry didn't have an answer. He didn't know anyone with this kind of power, this kind of money. He'd saved plenty of patients over 7 years, but none of them had looked like they traveled with armed security details and vehicles that could survive a military engagement. The lead vehicle's engine cut off. Then the second. Then all of them, one by one, until the only sound was rain drumming on metal and concrete, and the collective held breath of everyone watching. The lead vehicle's door opened. Not quickly, there was no urgency, no rush. The door swung wide with hydraulic smoothness, and a man stepped out into the rain with a kind of absolute confidence that marked someone who'd never questioned his right to exist in any space he chose to occupy. Alpha. Larry knew it before his conscious mind could catalog the specifics. The way the man moved, predatory grace wrapped in expensive tailoring. The way the rain seemed to part around him, or maybe that was just the impression created by someone who existed in a different reality than ordinary people. The way every other shape in every other vehicle remained perfectly still, awaiting this man's next move. He was tall. Over 6 feet, perhaps 6'2" or 6'3", with the kind of build that suggested both discipline and danger. Sharp features that could have been carved from stone or ice, high cheekbones, a jawline that looked weaponized, Eyes that Larry couldn't see clearly through the rain but could feel tracking across the space between the vehicle and the ambulance bay. Tracking, assessing, finding. Finding him. The man's hair was dark, styled with the kind of precision that required either significant time or significant money, probably both. His suit, because of course he wore a suit, because men like this didn't own casual clothing, was charcoal gray, three-piece, fitted so perfectly it had to be custom. The rain darkened the fabric immediately, but he didn't flinch, didn't hurry, didn't seem to notice or care that water was ruining what probably cost more than Larry's entire wardrobe. Behind him, the other vehicle doors opened in synchronized silence. Men emerged, all alphas, Larry's instinct screamed, all dangerous in the way that professional violence was dangerous. They wore black tactical clothing, the kind with too many pockets and too much Kevlar. They moved into formation with practiced ease, creating a human barrier between the lead vehicle and the rest of the world. But the man in the center, the one who'd emerged first, he kept walking. Straight toward the ambulance bay. Straight toward where Larry stood, soaked and shivering and utterly confused, with $147.43 in his account and no idea why 6 armored vehicles and what looked like a private army had just turned Sacred Heart Medical Center into a crime scene waiting to happen. The man's shoes, Italian leather, Larry noted with a kind of hysterical precision that came from shock, clicked against the wet concrete. Measured. Deliberate. The sound carried despite the rain, despite the distance, despite everything. Larry should run. That was the smart move, the survival move. Because men who traveled like this, who commanded this kind of resources, they didn't arrive at hospital emergency rooms at 4:47 a.m. for anything good. But Larry's feet stayed planted, and the man kept coming, and behind the hospital windows, an entire night shift staff watched history occur without understanding what they were witnessing. The man stopped 10 feet away. And then, impossibly, he smiled. Not the predatory smile Larry expected. Something else. Something that looked like relief and recognition and a debt about to be paid. "Sir," the man said, and his voice cut through the rain like the lights had cut through the darkness, clear, precise, carrying the weight of absolute sincerity. And Larry's world tilted sideways, because that voice was familiar in a way that didn't make sense, in a way that reached back through years and touched something he tried very hard to forget. The man stopped 3 feet from Larry, close enough that the white gold light from the convoy painted them both in stark relief, close enough that Larry could see details his mind was already cataloging with the clinical precision that came from years of emergency medicine. The slight asymmetry of the left eyebrow, the faint scar along the jawline, the way the rain caught on sharp cheekbones and ran like tears that would never actually fall. And the eyes. Dark, intense, focused with the kind of attention that felt like being examined at a cellular level. Eyes that Larry knew. The memory hit him like a physical blow. 8 years ago. Not Sacred Heart, not this city, not this life. A field hospital in a country whose name he still couldn't pronounce correctly, where he'd volunteered during his clinical rotations because student loans were deferred for international humanitarian work and because he'd been young enough to think idealism was a sustainable fuel source. A man bleeding out on a cot that was more rust than frame. Shrapnel wounds, multiple, catastrophic. Alpha pheromones so thick in the air they'd burned Larry's nose even through his scent blockers. Everyone else had been triaging, moving past this patient to ones with better odds, because the field hospital had 15 cots and 40 casualties and mathematics demanded sacrifice. But Larry had stopped. Had assessed. Had seen that the wounds looked worse than they were, that the bleeding could be controlled, that this man wanted to live with a ferocity that blazed in his eyes even as shock tried to drag him under. Larry had stayed. For 6 hours, through mortar fire and evacuation orders, he'd stayed. Had stitched and compressed and bullied that man's body back from the edge through sheer stubborn refusal to let another person become a statistic. And when it was done, when the man's eyes had finally focused and found Larry's face, he'd whispered something in Korean that Larry hadn't understood. Something that sounded like a promise. "You remember," the man said now, and it wasn't a question. "Theo Lee." The name came out rough, disbelieving. The scared kid on the cot had become this, all predatory grace and expensive violence, power worn like a second skin. Theo's smile widened, and something in his expression softened. "You remembered my name. You told me 17 times. Larry's voice sounded distant to his own ears. You kept saying it like you were afraid you'd forget who you were. I was afraid I'd forget to thank you. Theo took one step closer, closing the distance to less than arm's reach, and then he did something that made the world tilt sideways, made reality crack open and spill impossible things into the rain-soaked night. He bowed. Not a casual nod, not a polite inclination of the head. A deep, formal bow, from the waist, head lowered, the kind that acknowledged unpayable debts and sacred obligations. The kind that dissolved hierarchy and status and every social construct that said alpha stood above omegas in the natural order of things. The rain beat down on Theo's bent shoulders, darkened his perfect suit, and he didn't move. Didn't rush. He held the bow for 3 seconds, 5, long enough that everyone watching, and everyone was watching, understood this wasn't performance. This was reverence. Sir, Theo said, voice carrying despite the rain, despite the impossibility of this moment. I owe you a debt I can never fully repay. You gave me my life when the world had already written me off. Behind Theo, movement. The 12 men from the convoy, all of them dangerous, all of them alpha, all of them watching their boss with expressions of absolute loyalty, stepped forward in unison. And then they bowed. Every single one of them. A coordinated acknowledgement that bent pride and power and designation into something that looked like honor. 12 men bowing in the rain to an Omega nurse in borrowed clothes, standing on a curb with $147.43 in his account and no job and no future. Larry couldn't breathe. Inside the hospital, faces pressed harder against the windows. Phones were out now, recording, documenting this impossible scene. And there, pushing through the crowd with an expression that cycled rapidly through confusion, recognition, and dawning horror, Holloway. The director stopped at the glass, one hand pressed flat against the window as if he could push through it, as if proximity would help him understand what he was witnessing. His face drained of color as Theo straightened, as the implications arranged themselves into an equation even a profit-obsessed administrator could calculate. But Theo didn't look at Holloway. Didn't acknowledge the hospital or its staff or anyone except the soaking wet Omega standing in front of him. We've been searching for you, sir, Theo continued, and his voice carried the weight of absolute sincerity, of resources spent and years invested in finding one person in a world designed to make people like Larry invisible. I apologize for the delay. By the time I recovered enough to begin the search, you'd already left the volunteer organization. No forwarding address, no contact information. You disappeared. I came home. Larry's voice sounded strange, too small for this moment, too ordinary for whatever was happening. I had student loans. I had a life. You saved mine, Theo said simply. And I've spent 8 years trying to return the favor. Trying to find you so I could. He paused, glanced back at the convoy, at his men still standing in respectful attention. So I could offer you what you deserve. What you've always deserved. A black Mercedes pulled up behind the convoy, and Larry recognized it with a jolt of surreal horror. Holloway's car. The director was coming outside, probably to smooth this over, to exercise whatever authority he thought he still possessed, to reclaim control of a situation that had spiraled so far beyond his comprehension it might as well be happening on another planet. Theo must have sensed it too, because his expression shifted, the warmth bleeding away into something colder, something that reminded Larry this man commanded armed convoys and traveled with enough security to invade small countries. Director Holloway, Theo said without turning around, his voice carrying across the rain-soaked space with perfect clarity, I suggest you stay inside. It wasn't a request. Holloway froze halfway out of the hospital entrance, one hand still on the door, his carefully cultivated authority crumbling against the reality of Theo's presence. Behind him, Marcus and 2 other security guards stood in the doorway, hands hovering near radios they wouldn't dare use. Theo turned back to Larry, and the warmth returned like someone had flipped a switch. You're soaked. You're exhausted. And if I'm reading the situation correctly, his eyes flicked to Larry's damp undershirt, to the absence of a badge, to the barely concealed devastation in Larry's posture. You've had what my people would call a very bad night. Larry laughed. He couldn't help it. The sound came out broken and slightly hysterical, because very bad night was such a catastrophic understatement it achieved a kind of poetry. Come with me, Theo said, and extended his hand. Please. Let me finally repay what I owe. Larry stared at Theo's extended hand, perfectly manicured, steady, offering salvation or complication or both. Behind them, Holloway's Italian leather shoes clicked against wet concrete with the desperate rhythm of a man trying to reclaim ground he'd already lost. "Gentlemen, I don't know what this is about, but this is hospital property, and I'm going to have to ask you to." One of the 12 men moved. He was taller than Theo, broader through the shoulders, with a face that looked like it had argued with violence and lost repeatedly. A scar cut from his left eyebrow down to his jaw, pulling his expression into something permanently dangerous. He stepped between Holloway and Theo with the casual efficiency of someone who'd done this exact maneuver 1,000 times, and when he smiled, it was the kind of smile predators used right before they stopped playing with their food. "Director Holloway." The man's voice was pleasant, conversational, which made it worse. "I'm Jin Park, Mr. Lee's head of security. We haven't been formally introduced, but I know quite a bit about you." He pulled out a phone, not the cheap kind Larry carried, something sleek and probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "It's remarkable what public records reveal about a person. Your administrative history, for instance. 7 wrongful termination lawsuits settled out of court. 12 formal complaints filed with the state medical board. That unfortunate incident involving—" "I don't know what you think you're doing," Holloway interrupted, but his voice had lost its edge. His eyes kept flicking to the other men, to their tactical clothing and their absolute stillness, calculating odds that didn't favor him. "But this is inappropriate, and I'm going to have to call." "The police?" Jin's smile widened. "Please do. I'm sure they'd be fascinated to learn about the emergency patient you denied care to last month. The one whose family is still looking for grounds to sue. Or we could discuss your creative interpretation of billing codes, though that might take all night." Holloway's face went from pale to gray. Those are sealed records." "Nothing is sealed if you know where to look." Jin stepped closer, and despite being roughly the same height, he somehow gave the impression of towering over the director. "But let's focus on tonight. On Larry Chen, specifically. The nurse you just terminated. I believe there was some documentation? Something about termination with cause?" "That's an internal personnel matter," Holloway managed, but sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cold rain. "Was," Jin corrected gently. "Past tense. Because Mr. Lee suggests, and when Mr. Lee suggests things, reality tends to rearrange itself accordingly, that you reconsider any documentation regarding tonight's termination." He paused, let the words settle like sediment. "In fact, he suggests that Larry Chen's employment record shows a resignation. Voluntary. With excellent references. Effective immediately, with full benefits paid out through the end of the quarter." "I can't just—" "You can." Jin's voice dropped to something almost intimate. "And you will. Because the alternative is that Mr. Lee takes a very personal interest in Sacred Heart Medical Center. In its finances. In its administrative practices. In every decision you've made over the last 5 years." He leaned in, and Holloway actually flinched. "Do you really want that kind of attention, Director?" It wasn't a threat. Threats implied possibility, implied choice. This was certainty delivered with the smile of a predator who'd already decided how the hunt would end. Holloway looked past Jin to where Theo stood, still waiting for Larry's answer, hands still extended. Looking for an appeal to reason, to alpha solidarity, to anything that would restore the natural order where hospital administrators had power and nurses, especially Omega nurses, didn't merit private armies and armored convoys. Theo didn't even glance his direction. I'll have HR process the paperwork," Holloway said finally, and the defeat in his voice was almost painful to hear. "Almost. Excellent decision." Jin's smile turned warm, congratulatory, the kind you'd give a dog that finally learned not to shit on the carpet. "I'll have our legal team follow up in the morning to ensure everything is processed correctly. Just to help. We're very helpful." Meanwhile, Theo had shifted his attention entirely to Larry, as if Holloway had ceased to exist the moment Jin stepped in. His hand was still extended, but there was no impatience in the gesture, no demand. Just an offer, waiting. "I don't understand," Larry said quietly. "Why now? Why tonight? I've had people searching for 3 years." Theo's voice carried something that might have been regret. You covered your tracks well, probably not intentionally, just the natural consequence of student loans and transient housing and a system designed to make people disappear into paperwork. But 2 weeks ago, one of my investigators found your name on Sacred Heart staff directory. I came as soon as I could. 2 weeks ago. Before Larry had saved John Doe. Before Holloway's tablet flagged an $8,000 discrepancy. Before everything fell apart. Larry took Theo's hand. The Alpha's grip was warm, solid, and he guided Larry toward the lead vehicle with a hand that hovered at the small of his back, never touching, but somehow sheltering. Creating a bubble of space that the rain couldn't quite penetrate, that the cold couldn't quite reach. They were halfway to the Maybach when Larry caught it. The scent beneath expensive cologne and rain and alpha pheromones carefully controlled. Copper bright and organic and wrong. Blood. Fresh blood. Larry stopped walking, turned to face Theo fully. You're injured. It's nothing. Theo kept moving, kept guiding him forward with that not quite touch. You're bleeding. Larry's medical training overrode everything else. The exhaustion, the confusion, the surreal nature of being rescued by a man he'd saved 8 years ago. How badly? Where? Later. Theo's smile was strained now, and Larry could see the tension in his jaw, the too careful way he was moving. Your dignity first. You deserved better than being thrown out like trash. I needed, he paused, and something raw flickered across his features. I needed you to see that you matter. That what you did for me mattered. That this, he gestured vaguely at the convoy, at Jin still conversing with a pale Holloway, at the entire cinematic spectacle unfolding in Sacred Heart's ambulance bay. This was the least I could do. You delayed medical treatment. Larry's voice came out flat with the kind of anger that came from understanding. You're shot, or stabbed, or something worse, and you delayed treatment to come here. To do this. Theo met his eyes, and there was no apology in his expression. Your dignity first, he repeated. Always. The Maybach's interior was a study in controlled luxury, cream leather that looked like it had never known the indignity of actual use, wood paneling in some dark grain that probably cost more per square inch than Larry's entire security deposit, ambient lighting that shifted from cool blue to warm gold depending on some algorithm Larry couldn't begin to understand. The door closed with the kind of solid thunk that spoke of German engineering and obscene amounts of money, sealing them into a sanctuary of silence where even the rain became a distant whisper against bulletproof glass. Larry barely noticed any of it. Because Theo had leaned back against the leather seat, and the movement had caused his suit jacket to fall open, and the white dress shirt beneath, custom-tailored, probably Egyptian cotton, definitely ruined, was no longer white on the left side. It was dark. Saturated. The kind of dark that meant arterial bleeding or organ damage or both. Jesus Christ. Larry moved before conscious thought caught up with action, hands already reaching for Theo's shirt, fingers working buttons with the practiced efficiency of 7 years in emergency medicine. How long have you been bleeding? It's under control. Theo's voice was steady, but his breathing wasn't, too shallow, too carefully measured, the kind of controlled respiration that meant moving hurt and he was compensating. That's not what I asked. Larry got the shirt open, and his stomach dropped. The wound was on Theo's left side, just below the ribcage. Entry wound, no exit, which meant the bullet was still in there, doing damage with every breath, every movement, every heartbeat. A temporary dressing had been applied, the kind of field bandage that bought time but didn't solve problems. Blood had soaked through it hours ago, and fresh seepage suggested active bleeding beneath. Larry's hands moved to assess, light palpation around the wound site, checking for distension that would indicate internal bleeding, noting the heat that suggested inflammation or early infection. Theo's skin was cool to the touch everywhere except the wound site, which meant his body was shunting blood to core functions and failing to maintain peripheral circulation. Early shock. Maybe middle-stage shock. Not good. How long? Larry's voice came out flat, dangerous, the tone he used with patients who tried to lie about their drug use or the actual timeline of their symptoms. Theo met his eyes, and something in his expression shifted, a calculation being made, a decision about whether truth or comfort would serve better here. He chose truth. Since 11 p.m. Larry checked his phone. 5:03 a.m. 6 hours. Theo had been shot 6 hours ago and had delayed treatment to, what? To stage a dramatic rescue? To humiliate Holloway? To bow in the rain like some kind of period drama protagonist? You absolute idiot. The words came out before Larry could stop them, propelled by a fury that was mostly terror in disguise. 6 hours with an abdominal gunshot wound. Do you have any idea what that does to your survival odds? What complications you're risking? You could have bled out in that car. You could have. I had to find you first. Why? Larry's hands were still moving, checking pulse at the wrist, thready, fast, not good, noting the slight yellowing of the sclera that suggested liver involvement or biliary obstruction. Why was restoring my dignity worth dying for? Theo's smile was faint, exhausted, and somehow achingly genuine. You stayed with me for 6 hours in that field hospital. You had evacuation orders. Mortar fire was close enough that you could feel the concussions in your chest. Everyone else had already left, but you stayed. His breathing hitched, and Larry saw him fight through pain that had to be excruciating. You stayed because you decided my life was worth saving, even though I was nobody to you. A casualty with bad odds and no insurance and no reason for you to risk your own safety. That was my job. No. Theo's hand caught Larry's wrist, not restraining, just connecting. That was your choice. The protocol said leave. The odds said leave. Everyone else left. You chose to stay. His grip tightened fractionally. Tonight, you made the same choice. You saved someone the system said wasn't worth saving, and it cost you everything. Your job, your reputation, your future. And I couldn't, his voice broke slightly, I couldn't let you stand in the rain like unwanted refuse after sacrificing yourself for your principles. Not when I had the power to change it. So you sacrificed yourself instead. Larry pulled his hand free, pressed both palms flat against the leather seat to stop them from shaking. You delayed life-saving treatment for 6 hours to make a point. To restore what was taken from you. Theo's eyes were starting to lose focus, pupils slightly dilated, definite shock progression. Your dignity. Your value. The acknowledgement that you matter, that your choices matter, that the debt I owe you is unpayable but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to. The rest of your life might be about 40 minutes if we don't get you to a trauma surgeon. Larry leaned forward, knocked on the privacy partition that separated them from the driver. It slid down immediately, revealing another alpha in tactical gear whose expression suggested he'd been listening to every word and was deeply concerned about his boss's vital signs. Hospital? The driver asked. No. Theo's voice carried enough command to cut through his obvious deterioration. Helix Tower. East Wing Surgical Suite. You have a surgical suite? Larry stared at him. I have several. Theo's smile was fading, consciousness starting to slip. Occupational necessity. The East Wing is closest. Fully equipped. But no staff. They're out on another emergency. So no surgeons. No surgeons, Theo confirmed, and his eyes found Larry's with painful clarity. Just you. If you're willing. Larry looked at the blood seeping through the bandage, at the alpha who delayed treatment for 6 hours to honor a debt paid 8 years ago in a field hospital halfway across the world. At the most insane, wasteful, strangely touching gesture anyone had ever made on his behalf. Drive, he told the driver. Fast. And someone radio ahead, I need that surgical suite prepped, I need O-negative blood ready, and I need someone who can follow orders without asking questions. The Maybach surged forward, and Larry's hands went back to Theo's wound, applying pressure, buying time, doing what he'd always done, refusing to let someone die when he had the skill to prevent it. Even if that someone was an idiot alpha with a martyr complex and a fundamental misunderstanding of risk-benefit analysis. Stay with me, Larry ordered, and Theo's answering smile suggested he'd been planning to do exactly that. Helix Tower rose 42 stories into the pre-dawn sky like a monument to everything Larry had never been. Powerful, untouchable, the kind of wealth that reshaped reality around its own gravity. Glass and steel twisted upward in a spiral that caught the city lights and threw them back as declaration, we exist above you. The convoy pulled into an underground garage that looked more like a military installation than parking. Concrete reinforced enough to survive airstrikes, security cameras every 12 feet, armed guards at checkpoints who waved them through without question. The Maybach stopped at a private elevator bay, and before Larry could fully process the transition, Theo was being helped out by two of his men with the kind of careful efficiency that suggested they'd done this before. Too many times before. Careful with his left side, Larry snapped, moving to support Theo's weight from the right. That wound is unstable, and if you jostle it wrong. We know, one of the guards said, and his voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd seen his boss bleed too many times to count. We've got him. The elevator was the size of Larry's entire apartment, with mirrors and brass and a floor made of something that looked like marble but was probably more expensive. It shot upward with the kind of smooth acceleration that made Larry's stomach drop, and the numbers on the digital display climbed, 10, 20, 30, 40, 41, 42, and then P, because of course Theo lived in a penthouse that required its own designation. The doors opened directly into a space that redefined Larry's understanding of residential architecture. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around three sides, offering a panoramic view of a city just beginning to wake. The interior was all clean lines and expensive minimalism, furniture that looked like art installations, art that looked like furniture, everything in shades of cream and charcoal and chrome. It should have felt cold, but the ambient lighting was warm, and despite the size, the space somehow managed to feel intimate rather than cavernous. Larry didn't have time to appreciate any of it. East Wing, Theo managed, his weight sagging more heavily against the guards. Through there. They moved down a corridor lined with doors that probably led to bedrooms or offices or whatever billionaire mafia bosses needed multiple rooms for, and stopped at double doors at the end. One of the guards keyed in a code, pressed his palm to a biometric scanner, and the doors swung open with pneumatic silence. Larry's breath caught. The surgical suite was a trauma surgeon's fever dream made manifest. Stainless steel and glass, equipment so new it probably hadn't hit the commercial market yet. A surgical table that looked like it belonged in a sci-fi film, adjustable, with built-in monitoring systems and lighting that could be programmed to specific wavelengths. Monitors displayed vitals in real time with resolution sharp enough to count individual pixels. An anesthesia station that put Sacred Heart's ancient equipment to shame. Instrument trays already prepped and sterile. A blood bank refrigerator that, when Larry checked it, contained at least 40 units of various blood types. On the far wall, locked cabinets held medications, and not just the standard emergency drugs. Larry recognized labels from research trials, experimental compounds that shouldn't exist outside university hospitals with 6-month waiting lists. Revascol 7, the drug that had cost him his job, sat on the shelf like it was nothing. Like $8,000 doses were casual inventory. Jesus, Larry whispered, and the word felt inadequate. I told you, Theo said, being lowered carefully onto the surgical table by his men, occupational necessity. This is better than most hospital trauma bays. Larry moved to the sink, started the surgical scrub protocol on autopilot while his mind tried to process the implications. This is better than Sacred Heart's trauma bay. Sacred Heart, one of the guards said flatly, is a shithole that treats people like spreadsheet entries. Larry couldn't argue with that assessment. He turned back to find 5 guards standing in the surgical suite, all of them watching him with expressions that ranged from concern to barely contained panic. Big men, dangerous men, alphas who looked like they could kill with their bare hands and had probably done exactly that. All of them looking at Larry like he was the only thing standing between their boss and a body bag. Where's your medical staff? Larry asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it anyway. Emergency extraction in Seoul, the guard who'd spoken earlier said. His name tag read minute, and a scar bisected his right eyebrow. They left 4 hours ago. Won't be back for at least 12 hours. So it's just me. Just you, Minute confirmed. Larry looked around the room again, at the equipment he'd only read about in medical journals, at the drugs that could save Theo's life or kill him if dosed incorrectly, at the surgical instruments gleaming under lights that probably cost more than his student loan debt. No anesthesiologist to manage sedation and pain control. No surgical nurses to hand him instruments with practiced telepathy. No attending physician to consult if something went catastrophically wrong. No backup. No safety net. Just him, 5 terrified guards with 0 medical training, and an alpha slowly bleeding out on a table that cost more than most people's cars. Theo's eyes found his, Still conscious, still aware despite the blood loss and the pain that had to be overwhelming. "I trust you," he said quietly. "I've trusted you for 8 years." Larry dried his hands, moved to the supply cabinet, started pulling on a surgical gown. "I need 3 of you scrubbed in," he said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt. "The rest need to be monitoring vitals and ready to fetch anything I ask for." He looked at Minitu, biggest hands. "You're my primary assistant. Those 2, he pointed at the guards flanking the door, "you're on monitoring. And someone needs to be ready to hand me instruments." "We don't know anything about surgery," Minute said, but he was already moving toward the scrub sink. "You're about to learn." Larry pulled on sterile gloves with sharp snaps that punctuated his words. "Because the alternative is your boss dies on this table, and I'm guessing that's not an acceptable outcome for anyone in this room." The guards moved with military efficiency, following Larry's rapid-fire instructions about scrubbing protocols and sterile fields and what happens if they contaminate anything. They were terrified, Larry could see it in their eyes, smell it beneath their alpha bravado, but they were also loyal enough to follow orders from an Omega nurse they'd met 20 minutes ago. Larry approached the surgical table, looked down at Theo's pale face, at the wound that was still seeping blood despite pressure and makeshift bandaging. "Last chance to tell me there's a trauma surgeon hiding somewhere in this tower," Larry said. Theo's smile was faint but genuine. "Just you. It's always been just you." Larry took a breath, centered himself in the way he'd learned during his first week of emergency rotations when her attending had told him that panic was a luxury trauma nurses couldn't afford. He positioned himself at the table, accepted the scalpel that Minute handed him with shaking hands, and let 7 years of training take over. "Let's keep you alive," he said, and made the first incision. The monitor's steady beep was a countdown clock Larry didn't need. Theo's blood pressure was 94/62, low but functional. In 20 minutes, maybe less, it would drop below 90 systolic, and they'd be in critical territory where organs started failing and bodies made the decision to shut down rather than fight. 20 minutes to find the bleeder, repair it, and close. 20 minutes with equipment he'd only read about in journals and 3 guards who looked like they might pass out before the patient did. Larry's first incision opened Theo's abdomen with a kind of precision that came from muscle memory, clean, controlled, deep enough to access the peritoneal cavity without causing unnecessary damage. Blood welled up immediately, dark and abundant, confirming what Larry had suspected: internal bleeding, significant volume, likely splenic involvement. "Suction," Larry said, and Minute fumbled with the instrument before getting it positioned correctly. The guard's hands were shaking badly enough that the suction catheter rattled against the steel retractor. "Steady," Larry said, not looking up from the surgical field. "I need you steady, Minute. Your boss's life depends on it." Min's hands stopped shaking. Larry worked quickly, placing retractors to hold the incision open, exposing the abdominal cavity. The spleen was immediately visible, enlarged, dark purple, with a laceration along its inferior border that was pumping blood with each of Theo's heartbeats. Not a complete rupture, which was good. But bad enough that it needed immediate intervention. "Blood pressure," Larry called out. 92/60, one of the monitors responded, reading the display with the uncertainty of someone interpreting a foreign language. "Dropping." They had 15 minutes now. Maybe less. "I need more light here," Larry said, and someone adjusted the surgical lamp, flooding the field with white gold illumination that made the blood look almost black. "Better. Minute, see that vessel there?" He indicated with a hemostat. "That's your splenic artery. It's nicked, and it's the primary bleeder. I'm going to clamp it, and when I do, the bleeding should slow significantly." "What if you miss?" Min's voice was tight with fear. "I won't." Larry's hands moved with absolute certainty, placing the clamp with the kind of precision that made the difference between life and exsanguination. The jaws closed around the vessel, and immediately the pulsing arterial spray reduced to a manageable ooze. "Jesus," Minute breathed. "Not quite, but I appreciate the sentiment." Larry was already moving to the next step, assessing the full extent of the damage. The bullet had entered at an angle, grazed the spleen, and lodged itself against the posterior abdominal wall. Lucky. 6 inches to the right and it would have hit the kidney or the aorta, and Theo would have bled out hours ago in that Maybach. I need the bullet out before I can repair the spleen, Larry said, speaking to himself as much as to his makeshift surgical team. It's not in a critical location, but it's putting pressure on surrounding tissue and probably causing additional bleeding. He switched to a different instrument, something that looked like very expensive needle nose pliers, and carefully, incrementally, worked the bullet free from where it had embedded itself in muscle tissue. The extraction took 3 minutes that felt like 30, and when the deformed metal finally came free with a wet pop, one of the guards actually gagged. Out, Larry snapped at the guard who'd made the sound. If you're going to vomit, do it in the hallway. The man fled, and Larry continued working. The splenic laceration was complex, not a clean cut but a tear with irregular edges that would need careful suturing to prevent additional bleeding. Larry's hands moved with the mechanical precision of 7 years spent in emergency medicine, placing sutures with spacing so exact they could have been measured with calipers. Blood pressure. 88/58. Shit. Critical range. They were out of time. I need 2 units of O negative, now, Larry said. Minute, there's a rapid infuser in that cabinet. Bring it here and set it up. I'll talk you through it. The next 5 minutes were controlled chaos. Larry sutured while simultaneously instructing Minute on how to establish the rapid infusion, while monitoring Theo's deteriorating vitals, while making split-second decisions about whether to prioritize speed or precision. Every choice mattered. Every stitch had to hold. Every second counted. Theo's eyes had closed at some point, but his breathing continued, shallow, rapid, the body's desperate attempt to compensate for blood loss. His lips were pale, his skin cool to the touch when Larry's arm brushed against him. Early signs of shock becoming late signs of shock, becoming the kind of statistics that trauma surgeons cited in mortality reviews. Stay with me, Larry muttered, not sure if he was talking to Theo or himself. We're not done yet. You don't get to die after making me perform surgery in your stupidly expensive penthouse. Minute made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. The rapid infuser started pumping O negative into Theo's system, and Larry watched the monitor obsessively. 88/58. 89/60. 90/62. The numbers crept upward with agonizing slowness, but they were moving in the right direction. Larry finished the splenic repair, tested his sutures with gentle pressure to ensure they'd hold, then moved to close the abdominal cavity. Layer by layer, peritoneum, fascia, subcutaneous tissue, skin. Each layer required different suture material, different techniques, different attention to detail. By the time he placed the final skin suture, his hands were cramping and his back was screaming from hunching over the surgical table for, he checked the clock, 47 minutes. 47 minutes that felt like years. Blood pressure. 102/68. Larry's breath came out in a rush he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Stable. His stable. The relief in the room was palpable. Minutes sagged against the instrument tray, and one of the monitoring guards actually sank into a chair, head in his hands. The guard who'd fled to vomit reappeared in the doorway, looking sheepish and hopeful. Larry stepped back from the table, stripped off his blood-soaked gloves, and felt the adrenaline crash hit like a physical blow. His hands were steady, they were always steady when lives were at stake, but now that the crisis had passed, exhaustion poured into the space where emergency focus had been, and it took everything he had to remain standing. He needs monitoring, Larry said, and his voice sounded distant to his own ears. Every 15 minutes for the next 3 hours, vitals, level of consciousness, any signs of bleeding. If his blood pressure drops below 90 or if he develops a fever, I need to know immediately. You're staying? Minute asked. Larry looked down at Theo's pale face, at the sutured incision that represented his third time saving this man's life. Once in a field hospital 8 years ago, once in a Maybach an hour ago, and once on this table with equipment he barely understood and assistants who'd learned trauma surgery through sheer desperation. I'm staying, he said, because leaving wasn't an option, because the debt between them had become something more complicated than simple obligation, because Theo had delayed treatment for 6 hours to restore Larry's dignity and that kind of insanity required supervision. There's a chair in the observation room, Minute said quietly, gesturing to a glass-walled space Larry hadn't noticed. And coffee. Probably terrible coffee, but coffee. Terrible coffee sounds perfect, Larry said, and let himself be guided away from the surgical table, away from the evidence of what he'd just accomplished with nothing but skill and stubbornness and 3 terrified guards who'd followed orders from an Omega because competence didn't give a damn about designation. Behind him, the monitors beeped their steady rhythm, a heartbeat, a promise, a life continuing because someone had decided it was worth saving. Again. 3 hours later, Theo was stable. Larry stood in the observation room, watching the monitors with the kind of vigilance that came from knowing exactly how quickly stability could become crisis. But the numbers held steady, blood pressure solid at 108/70, heart rate regular at 78 beats per minute, oxygen saturation at 98%. The sutures were holding, the bleeding had stopped, and Theo's breathing had deepened into the kind of genuine sleep that came after sedation wore off and the body decided it was safe to rest. Minute had taken up position in a chair beside the surgical table, armed and alert despite the exhaustion written across his scarred face. The other guards rotated through in shifts, bringing coffee that was indeed terrible, offering food that Larry couldn't stomach, and treating him with a deference that felt surreal after a night of being escorted out of Sacred Heart like a criminal. Larry's phone had been buzzing for the last hour. He'd ignored it, focused on Theo's vitals, on watching for any signs of complications. But now, with the crisis definitively past and dawn breaking over the city beyond the windows, he finally pulled it from his pocket. 17 missed calls. All from the same number. Director Holloway. 3 voicemails, each progressively more desperate. Larry played them on low volume, leaning against the observation room glass. The first, Larry, we need to talk. There's been a misunderstanding. Call me back. The second, I've spoken with HR. We can work something out. Your position is still available if you want it. We can discuss the incident and find a mutually beneficial resolution. The third, Larry, please. I'm prepared to offer reinstatement with a 15% raise and a formal apology. The termination paperwork was never filed. We can make this go away. Just call me back. Larry deleted all 3 without listening to the end. He walked out of the observation room, through the penthouse's main living space, and found the wall of glass that opened onto a balcony wrapping around the tower's northwest corner. The door slid open with whisper-quiet precision, and he stepped out into air that was cold and clean and 42 stories above the problems that had defined his life 6 hours ago. The city was waking up below him. Early morning traffic beginning to clog the arteries between buildings, lights flickering on in apartments and offices, the first brave souls appearing on sidewalks with coffee cups and briefcases and the resigned expressions of people commuting toward jobs that would slowly kill them over 30 years. Sacred Heart Medical Center was visible from here, a squat, utilitarian building 4 miles east, already processing its morning trauma cases, already making calculations about which lives were worth saving based on insurance coverage and profit margins. Larry had spent 7 years in that building. 7 years proving he belonged despite his designation, despite the whispers and the concerns and the designation-based discrimination that was always present but never officially acknowledged. 7 years of saving lives and fighting a system designed to make him fail. And in one night, it had all been stripped away. Then offered back. Then made irrelevant. His phone rang again. Holloway, of course. The man had persistence, Larry would give him that. He answered this time. Director. Larry. Holloway's relief was audible. Thank God. Listen, I've been thinking about what happened, and I believe we acted hastily. You're a valuable member of our team, Anne. I saved a man's life, Larry interrupted. That's what happened. I used an expensive drug to save someone the system had already written off, and you fired me for it. We can move past that. I'm offering you your job back with a raise, with a formal apology, with whatever you need to. To what? To forget that you humiliated me in front of the entire night shift? To pretend that this hospital values anything beyond profit margins? To go back to a system that treats omegas like liabilities and patients like ledger entries? Silence on the other end. Then, what do you want, Larry? It was the first honest thing Holloway had said all night. Nothing you can give me, Larry said quietly, and ended the call. He stood there holding the phone, watching the city wake up, and felt the weight of the decision settling into his bones. Sacred Heart had been his entire professional identity. Walking away from it, Truly walking away, not just being forced out, meant starting over. Meant admitting that 7 years of fighting had been spent trying to reform something fundamentally broken. You should be resting. Larry turned. Theo stood in the balcony doorway, leaning against the frame with the careful posture of someone managing significant pain. He was shirtless, bandages wrapped around his abdomen, wearing only the dress pants from his ruined suit. The morning light caught on his skin, highlighting the surgical sutures that would scar, highlighting the lean muscle that spoke of discipline and violence in equal measure. You should be in bed, Larry counted. Under sedation. Definitely not walking around less than 4 hours post-op. I heard you on the phone. Theo moved onto the balcony with slow, measured steps. Holloway trying to buy you back. His persistent. His desperate. Theo stopped beside Larry, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. He knows what he lost. Larry's phone buzzed again. Another call from Holloway. He stared at it, at the name flashing on the screen, at the lifeline being offered back to a life that had already proven it would destroy him incrementally, one shift at a time. I'm building something, Theo said quietly. His voice carried over the wind, over the distant traffic noise, intimate despite the open air. A medical network. Underground, technically, though we prefer to call it alternative infrastructure. Clinics throughout the city serving populations the legitimate system discards. People without insurance, without documentation, without the right designation or the right address or the right anything. Larry looked at him. That's illegal. Extremely. Theo's smile was sharp. It's also necessary. The system you just left? It's not broken by accident. It's designed exactly as intended, to maximize profit while minimizing care for anyone who can't pay. I'm building the alternative. And you want me to, what? Run a clinic. Lead the entire network. Theo turned to face him fully, and despite the obvious pain, his expression was absolutely serious. Medical director. You'd have oversight of 8 existing facilities and plans for 12 more. Full autonomy, your protocols, your ethics, your decisions. No administrators second-guessing you, no insurance companies dictating care, no one questioning whether saving a life is financially viable. Larry's breath caught. That's insane. I'm 27 years old. I'm an omega in a field that barely tolerates. You're brilliant, Theo interrupted. You saved my life twice in one night with nothing but skill and refusal to accept that some people aren't worth saving. You performed abdominal surgery with 3 guards as your surgical team and equipment you'd never touched before. You're exactly what this network needs. What's the catch? The catch is that it's illegal, dangerous, and you'll be working with patients the system has abandoned, which means complicated cases, poor outcomes, and constant resource challenges. Theo paused. Also, I'll be your primary benefactor and occasional patient, which creates a complicated power dynamic that we'll need to navigate carefully. What's the salary? Larry asked, because he still had rent and suppressants and student loans, because Dignity didn't pay bills, because he'd learned at 4:47 a.m. on a hospital curb that principals required financing. Theo named a number. Larry's breath stopped. It was more than double what Sacred Heart had paid him. More than he'd make in 5 years at most hospitals. Enough to pay off his student loans in 2 years. Enough to never worry about suppressant costs or rent or whether he could afford to eat and pay utilities in the same month. Plus benefits, Theo added. Health insurance that actually covers Omega-specific care. Housing allowance if you want to move somewhere safer. Education funding if you want to pursue additional certifications. Why? The word came out raw. Why this much? Why me? Theo's expression softened into something that looked dangerously like affection. Because 8 years ago, you decided my life was worth saving when everyone else had already moved on. Because tonight, you did it again. Because you understand that medicine is supposed to be about healing, not profit. He paused. And because I've spent 8 years looking for you, and now that I've found you, I'm not letting you disappear into a system that will break you. Larry's phone rang again. Holloway, desperate, offering bribes and promises and a return to everything Larry had been before tonight. He looked at the phone. At Holloway's name. At the lifeline to a life he'd already grieved. Then he looked at Theo, at the alpha who'd delayed treatment to restore Larry's dignity, who'd built an underground medical network to serve people the system discarded, who was offering autonomy and resources and the chance to practice medicine the way Larry had always believed it should be practiced. Larry walked to the balcony railing. The drop below was dizzying, 4 to 2 stories of empty air, city streets far below where early morning traffic crawled like insects. He held his phone over the edge, felt the weight of it, felt the weight of everything it represented. "When do I start?" he asked. Theo's smile was sharp with satisfaction and something warmer, something that made Larry's pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with adrenaline and everything to do with the promise of complications that would be worth navigating. "Now," Theo said. "You start now." Larry dropped the phone. Watched it tumble through 4 to 2 stories of empty air, watched it disappear into the morning traffic below, taking Holloway's calls and Sacred Heart's protocols and 7 years of trying to reform a broken system with it. The fall took 3 seconds. Maybe 4. When the phone disappeared from view, Larry turned back to Theo, to the alpha standing too soon after surgery, offering a crown Larry hadn't known he wanted until it was within reach. "Okay," Larry said. "Let's build something better." Theo's answering smile promised that better would be complicated, dangerous, probably illegal, and absolutely worth it. He extended his hand, not in supplication this time, but in partnership, and Larry took it, felt the warmth of Theo's grip, felt the promise of something shifting between them from debt to something that didn't have a name yet but would, given time. Below them, the city continued waking. Sacred Heart processed its morning emergencies. Holloway probably called again, the phone ringing in some gutter or storm drain 42 stories down. But up here, on a balcony that cost more than most people's houses, with dawn breaking over glass and steel and the ruins of everything Larry used to be, the future felt like possibility rather than threat. Like power claimed rather than granted. Like a crown that had been waiting for someone brave enough, or desperate enough, to take it.